After months of rumors, leaks, set photos, and public freakouts, we finally got our first real look at Spider-Man Brand New Day. One of the most iconic characters ever, finally returning to the silver screen after a 5-year hiatus. And I'm not gonna lie, it looks pretty peak so far. But there's one detail that no one's really talking about, where even as good as this trailer looks, it may or may not break the entire movie. No, I can't really blame people for missing it. People are still losing it over Scorpion finally showing up after being teased a decade ago. Or Punisher trying to throw hands with Spidey, and heck, even just seeing Peter depressed and semi-broke, besides his phone, has people screaming. It feels like a comic brought to life, and yeah, that's awesome, as we get to see a soft reboot of the character suffering under the weight of responsibility and consequences in a world where no one knows who he is. Where Peter is forced to watch his loved ones move on with their lives without knowing he ever existed, causing him to focus entirely on being Spider-Man, the hero everyone admires and values, to hide away from the darkness and loneliness within his own personal life. Where I wouldn't be shocked if the movie is him tackling that inner darkness and having him spiral into self-negativity before he can get back up again, with his negative emotions causing him to mutate into the physical embodiment of that darkness, as he learns to value what comes with being both Spidey and Peter Parker and the balance and support he needs in his life. It's very reminiscent to Amazing Spider-Man 392, where Peter abandons his identity under the weight of loss and responsibility, believing that his humanity is the root of his suffering, as he and his loved ones always get hurt, and it causes him to spiral and disconnect before he can reground himself again. And to use that as the basis for this movie is great, as it brings something new and fresh to his development and journey, as he's forced to find balance within himself and reconnect with those around him, possibly turning into a weird man-spider creature along the way, but that's to be seen. But with such an important journey for the character, something needs to push his development and serve as an obstacle for him to overcome. The issue is, we still have no idea who that even is. Like, yeah, we see villains like Scorpion, Boomerang, Tarantula, The Hand, and it's already confirmed Tombstone is in the movie along with a bunch of C-list villains, but none of them feel like main villain material. Most of them will either be in a montage or get a small cameo. The only real villains that matter are Scorpion and Tombstone, where Scorpion will most likely be hired help, purposely picked because he has beef with Spidey, while Tombstone provides resources and backing to whoever the real villain is. It's all pretty odd because this is something that's never really happened before. We almost always know who the big bad is, like Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Electro, etc. And it's front and center with the marketing, but for here, it's nothing. It kind of feels like they're purposely showing off these villains not only to distract Spidey, but us on who the true villain is. Where the biggest hint we get is that whoever it is serves as a mental and potentially psychological threat that can possess anyone, which is highly problematic considering they made a civilian blast up the city in a tank. So imagine what that can do to someone like Peter, who's already isolating himself and in a pretty bad place mentally, forced to deal with the paranoia that anyone could be the enemy, which could force him to further detach himself from the people within his life out of fear they'll be in harm's way, reinforcing the idea that it's better to be alone. And while it's not much to go on, I think I might know who it is. Now after this trailer dropped, I'm pretty sure half the internet immediately went and searched up Spider-Man telepathic villains, and discovered the existence of Mindworm, which, fair enough. Now for those of you unfamiliar, he's an obscure Spider-Man villain who's a telepath that feeds off people's thoughts, emotions, and fears, where due to his mutation, it accidentally caused the death of his parents in classic comic book fashion. But on paper, it kinda makes sense considering the Department of Damage Control is supposed to serve as an antagonistic force against mutants. So having a telepathic mutant like Mindworm fits that aspect pretty easily, serving as a tragic byproduct of the system who becomes heavily unstable due to being captured and hunted down, where I could see groups like the DODC or Tombstone with the Hand attempting to recapture him for their own benefits. And if that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised if a certain head researcher for the DODC is semi-responsible for Mindworm's crash out, as in someone like Miles Warren, better known as the Jackal, a more popular Spidey villain who's been mentioned a lot lately, with many fans believing that Keith David is playing the character due to his voiceover in the trailer and his dialogue in reference to biochemistry. That, or he just really likes spiders. But I could totally see him being reworked into a genetics researcher exploring mutations within the movie, with his experiments delving into unethical treatment causing him to be at the center of this mess. I definitely don't think he'll be the main villain like a lot of people are suggesting, but I can see him playing a significant role role, especially for future installments. Where I mainly believe in his inclusion due to Amazing Spider-Man 129, which is the first appearance of the Punisher, who we already know is in the movie. But it also features the Jackal as a central antagonist working from behind the scenes. So I wouldn't be surprised if they attempted to adapt that in some way, considering the Jackal has never been on screen before. But as I said, I don't think he's the main villain. Heck, I don't even think Mindworm is the villain. I think Brand New Day's true villain is a lot darker than any of us really expected. With someone so fractured and broken to where Peter's not the only one looking for a cure, as the cruelty inflicted upon them makes them lash out both physically and mentally as her time begins to run out. And no, I'm not referring to Sadie Sink, who's potentially playing Jean Grey, but Adriana Soria. For those of you unfamiliar, Adriana Soria, better known as the Spider Queen, was originally part of a government experiment meant to awaken dormant mutant abilities, which, went horribly wrong, as she was deemed a failure and classified as insane, where years later she developed telepathic abilities and started wreaking havoc on New York, who also, funnily enough, has ties to the Jackal, also spider totems, but that's a whole other story. Now, I mention her specifically because when Brand New Day was initially in its production, someone had stated that the villain would be a female shapeshifter, and funny enough, Adriana turns into a giant spider. It's kinda metal actually, but I could see her backstory, similar to Mindworm, being reworked into the film to serve as a dark reflection of Peter, where due to Spider-Man's popularity between the movie's 4-year time gap, the DODC wants someone akin to him to be their marketable figurehead. Where Miles Warren, due to his biochemistry background, is tasked with creating a human mutate with Spidey's abilities, where Adriana, one of his test subjects, has her mutant genes accidentally triggered during the process, giving her telepathy and spider-based powers. However, after initially thinking she's a failure, the DODC attempt to dispose of her as she finds herself on the run and in isolation, where similar to Peter, her mental instability from being isolated and experimented on causes her to mutate further, giving into her fear and anger as she targets the DODC and scientific experts on getting a cure, where her telepathic mishaps are initially blamed on Sadie Sink's character, to where both Spidey and Punisher put her under their protection as Spidey tracks down the real villain, where he learns about the DODC's experimental cover-up as they try and save face by capturing Sadie Sink's character, while Adriana is taken in by Tombstone, who provides her with criminal resources to help her obtain a cure, as they throw whatever distraction in Spidey's way to keep his deteriorating mind physically occupied, where it creates a pretty strong parallel to Peter because now both of them are dealing with change, fear, and a ticking time clock that shows the true character of each person, as he has an opponent who can compete with him physically, but also pry into his insecurities and fears, representing the dark path he could easily fall into as he learns to reclaim his identity and reconnect with his loved ones and allies. And if they're able to nail that dynamic, then this has the potential to be one of the best Spider-Man movies ever. But that's also what makes it risky, because with this many moving parts and characters, the villain has to carry both the emotional and physical weight of the story, which typically doesn't go well for Spider-Man movies. The only way to make this work is to stay focused on what matters, delving into its themes of isolation and insecurity. If they do, then it could be something really special, but if they don't, it all falls apart. But with only 3 months until release, we'll probably find out sooner rather than later. But hey, even with that concern in mind, I'm still beyond excited for this movie. And I think a lot of that comes down to what Spider-Man has always meant to me. Like a lot of kids who grew up in the 2000s, I was raised on the Raimi trilogy, watching Spider-Man 1 and 2 on a repeat on this now old Sony DVD player. Back then, I only cared about seeing Spider-Man beat up the bad guy, but as you get older, you start to realize that the true heart and soul that makes Spider-Man is Peter Parker. It's the struggle, self-doubts, loneliness, the general hecticness of figuring out your life at a point where everything feels against you. He's not perfect, he messes up, falls behind, struggles to pay bills or get a job, and I think that's something a lot of us can identify with. And even with those hardships, he manages to get back up and keep going. And in this day and age, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Sure, it's a comic book movie, but it's one with a soul, and a reminder that even when things feel stacked up against you, you don't have to face it alone. If you made it this far, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the kind of content I'm making. This is Balthazar, signing off.